Special guests about wild and wacky topics about science, technology, engineering, and math. My name is Marcus, and I'll be your host for today. So, what is Untamed? Untamed was born out of Science Center's ambition to redefine guest experiences amid the pandemic, leveraging a multidimensional approach to spark curiosity and self-learning, both physically in person and virtually. With that, we have some very good news for everyone today. To celebrate all that is Untamed, we will be giving out two amazing prizes, kindly sponsored by the US Embassy. All you have to do is to share about your Untamed experience and hashtag UntamedSG on your social media pages to stand a chance to win. So, in today's Untamed conversation on the topic brain music interfaces, we have specially invited and very honored to have Dr. Grace Leslie of Music Technology at Georgia Tech, live from California in the USA. She'll be sharing with us how the music she has engineered can help people like you and me with our mental health and well-being. To our viewers, if you have any questions along the way, please put them down in the comments and we'll try to address them along the way or at the end of the session. So without ado, let us welcome the musician, the composer, and the music scientist, Dr. Grace Leslie.
Hi,
Hi, Dr.
everyone.
Grace Leslie. Dr. Grace, wonderful to have you with us today. It's about, I realize it's about 4 a.m. in the US right now. How is it going over there?
Oh, it's great. It's great to be back in Singapore. I really miss it as well.
All right. So to start off, can I invite you to introduce yourself to our viewers?
Sure. So my name is Grace Leslie. I'm an assistant professor of music technology at Georgia Tech, which is in Atlanta, Georgia in the United States.
All right. So I understand that you are the director of a community at Georgia Tech called Brain Music Lab. What does
I
the
am.
team do at Brain Music Lab?
Sure. So at Georgia Tech, when I arrived there, I started this lab in the music department called the Brain Music Lab. And if you don't mind, I'm actually going to show a little slide here so I can kind of explain to you guys what we do.
Sure.
All right. So you can see here that there's a lot of things that we do in the Brain Music Lab. We work with a bunch of physiological sensors. So this means sensors that we place on music listeners' heads and bodies, and we record signals that tell us something about what's going on inside their brain and their body as they're listening to music or playing music or engaging in music in some way. We also work with software that will stream that data in real time, which means that we kind of stream it as it's being recorded. We kind of instantly send it to the computer. And we then record it so that we can analyze this later on, or we actually turn it directly into music in real time so that the person can listen to what their brain and body signals sound like. And we're investigating ways that this process of listening to one's brain and body signals might have a beneficial effect for people. So everything that I do kind of exists along this kind of loop that you see here, where on the top left, you can see that we have somebody who is wearing a EEG cap, or this is an artistic rendering of the same. And we are recording EEG, which means electroencephalogram, which is the kind of small voltage changes that will happen along the surface of somebody's brain when a whole bunch of neurons start to fire all together in response to some kind of stimulus event, which means they are listening to a sound or seeing some kind of image, or in response to some kind of cognitive event, if they have a thought, a memory, that kind of thing. So we can only measure these voltage fluctuations when a whole ensemble of neurons start to fire synchronously, such that we end up getting a voltage pattern that we can measure on the person's scalp, regardless of the fact that it's a very small signal. And then we have this, the surface of the brain, there's a layer of skin-like tissue over the brain. There's liquid between the brain and the skull. We have the skull, and then we have the scalp skin on top of the skull, and then we have the hair. And then on top of all of that, we place a voltage sensor on the scalp, or actually a whole network of them. And when we do that, we can see not only how is the voltage on the surface of somebody's brain changing over time, but also how is the voltage different on one part of the brain than it is on another part of the brain. And if you can imagine, if we place a whole network of these sensors on the brain, we can actually try to pinpoint where some of the signal that we are registering is actually arriving from on the surface of the brain. That's what we call the cortex. So I have this EEG signal that you can see here, which is actually just the level of that voltage as it is changing in time. And we can see that there's multiple copies of this because we can see a similar signal coming from multiple different places on the brain. And then where you see this kind of arrow here is some kind of software that me and my collaborators have written that takes that EEG signal and then tries to estimate something about what that person is experiencing, either inside or how they might be responding to some kind of stimulus event. So that's why I kind of have this little animated bar graph here, which is meant to represent that we're taking all of this really complicated voltage signal and we actually boil that down to a very simple kind of estimation. Something like, if we were to give a number from 1 to 10 of how focused somebody is right now, what would that number be? Or if we were to give a number of how much they are attending to a particular music signal and how much we can see a trace of that in their EEG, what would that number be? The thing about making some kind of estimation like this is that we're putting some label on what they are experiencing. And then with that kind of judgment that we're making about somebody's internal state, we can then direct a computer algorithm to develop music in real time again that will try to reflect what that person's internal state is. So we can have a piece of music that might become more focused if the person is being more focused, or the music might become faster if the person is more anxious. So this is a way that we can kind of write computer software that can develop music that will reflect somebody's internal state. I like to put this last arrow here to represent the fact that if this is all happening in real time, again, in a kind of online way, this means that the person may have the opportunity to listen to this music, moments after the music is created from their own brain and body signals. And this means that we have a whole feedback loop here that we can work with, because not only are we affecting the music with the person's internal state, but we can also affect the person's internal state using the music. And so there's this really interesting feedback loop that we can work on at any one point in this loop. I like to show these two plots here because this kind of illustrates on a mathematical level the kinds of properties that make this possible. You can see on the left here is an example of the spectrum of the opening section of the Alvin Berg violin concerto. And this is a spectral plot, meaning that we see on the y-axis here are all of the different frequencies that are contained in that musical sound. So we have the very low frequencies, like the lowest notes on the piano are at the very bottom of that plot, and then the very high frequencies, like the high notes on the piano are at the top of that plot that you see there. And on the right-hand side, this is a very similar spectral plot, but this is actually showing the spectrum of somebody's EEG signal as they've been directed to open and close their eyes. And we can actually see here, you know, me putting these two plots side by side is my way of trying to illustrate how we can take EEG signal and we can take audio, which is the, you know, actual voltage fluctuation of a musical signal that we might play for somebody. And we can analyze them in very similar ways using the same kind of mathematical principles. And those allow us to take a signal, break that down into different frequency components, and then, you know, analyze what is happening on the spectral level over time. So, you know, all of the, you know, kinds of projects that we work on the Brain Music Lab kind of work with this mathematical principle in some way, that we can, you know, work with physiological signals, and we can work with music somewhat interchangeably and change one into the other, and then see what that tells us about the musical experience when we do that.
All right. So we have a question from one of our viewers. Her name is Jan. So her question goes, your work seems to combine a lot of neuroscience with maybe psychology and then computer science. How many disciplines do you need to study to do work like this?
That's a very good question. So in one way or another, I have studied formally all of those topics. I do like to say that the most helpful thing for me along the way in my education was learning the mathematical principles that really underlie all of this analysis that we're doing. So the kinds of work that we do when we're working with these kinds of signals on the spectral level, like I'm showing you in this slide here, and I'm gonna actually stop sharing. Those were actually, you know, the most helpful things to learn, because the math really exists across all of those disciplines, and really knowing linear algebra very well, right? That is going to be applied in psychology, it's going to be applied in computer science, it's going to be applied in neuroscience. But, you know, also all of the work that I'm showing you here today is made possible by the fact that I found really amazing collaborators who are all specialists in all of those fields that you mentioned there. And my role is really as somebody who will bridge across all of those disciplines, really coming from a musical point of view, but I'm not an expert in any one of those disciplines. And so a lot of the work that you're seeing here today is made possible by the fact that I worked with people who do specialize in neuroscience and specialize in you know, computational neuroscience, in computer science, and so forth.
All right, I hope that answers Jen's questions. So, moving on, Dr. Grace, your research is presently being used in the fight against epilepsy. Can you share with us how does the music you have engineered help epilepsy patients?
Certainly. I'm going to find another slide that I can show you.
All right, in the meantime, keep the questions coming. All right, we'll try to answer the questions along the way.
So thank you for this question. I do want to preface my answer with, always saying that the work that I'm showing you today is work that has not reached the clinical level yet. This is still in the very early stages of investigation. And it's very much a very wild idea. So I think it's probably good for Untame. But this is this concept that we can work with various facets of musical signals, use them to represent typical healthy brain signals, or we can use them to show us something about epileptic activity in the brain as well. So this is an example here. I'm going to be showing you a little bit later about the kind of creative work that I do with these kinds of signals. But once I had developed a means to turn EEG into musical sound, I worked with this amazing epileptologist, Dr. Vijay Thadani, and we were working with this idea of how we might be able to turn the EEG signals of patients with epilepsy who are going into the hospital to undergo monitoring of their brainwaves, and to see if we can listen to the difference between seizure activity and non-seizure activity. And we found that the same algorithm that was developed for a live musical performance on the stage with relatively healthy EEG was actually useful, potentially useful for a doctor or nurse to be able to hear if a patient is experiencing a seizure or not. And not only if they're experiencing a seizure, but what kind of seizure they are experiencing. So this is kind of this example right here, going back to this feedback loop that we had of how we might be able to take EEG and then convert that directly into music and see what that sounds like. Going back to this feedback loop again, I have another project that I'm working on with Dr. Barbara Yopes and Robert Kwan at Dartmouth Hitchcock Hospital to see if we can develop new kinds of audio signals and music signals and use those to drive beneficial neural changes in patients with epilepsy. And the kind of underlying concept behind this idea is trying to recreate something of the beneficial effect that will happen when the patients who get electrical stimulators actually implanted in the brain to interrupt seizures. We're trying to work with some of the time varying elements of the way that the brain will respond to musical signals to try to approximate some of that neurostimulation idea. We call it sensory neurostimulation. This is a very exciting area in the field of neuroscience right now. And this is our way of, in some small part, trying to investigate how this might be involved in music listening. So we actually found in a small study that when we looked at patients with epilepsy, who are patients who exhibit a high number of these small spikes in their brain activity that we can register either using EEG, or in this case, we were using electrocardiography, which is actually a way of placing EEG sensors inside the brain when we have access to the brain itself, because the patient was being prepared for brain surgery. So we were actually working with very high quality brain data from this ECOG signal. And we showed that these patients who tend to have many of these small spikes in their brain activity, when they were presented with audio signals of this type, that they actually reduced the number of these spikes in their brain activity. So this is actually showing us that there's a potential for there being some very low level physiological response to listening to audio signals of this type that we may someday be able to create some kind of clinical application of this idea for the patients.
Okay, so actually we have another question from a viewer named Sam. His
Hi,
question
Sam.
is, how does music that is generated by the brain look like?
What does it look like?
Yeah.
Well, I think that he might be asking what it sounds like, perhaps.
I think so, but I think what he meant was how does the brain wave generated by the music look like?
Sure. So I'm actually going to show an example of somebody else's work because I think this is, probably the best example that I can show you. So I'm going to share my screen again, and I'm going to find this slide here. So what you're seeing here is the example of what we like to acknowledge as the first example of somebody creating a music performance using brainwaves. So this is a piece by Alvin Lucier that this particular recording is from 1965. So this is one of the very first performances that he himself did. He called this music for solo performer, possibly because he was the only person that he really trained to do this particular kind of performance. And so he meant that this is kind of a performance for he alone on stage. And I'm going to show you a video. It's okay if you might not hear the sound because it's actually very soft, but I wanted to answer Sam's question about what does it look like, because that's actually a very interesting question to ask. So I'm going to play this video and I'm going to make sure that the sound is on.
Yep, we can hear the sound.
Okay. And I'd like you to pay attention to what he's doing with his hands here. So in this piece, you can see here that he's wearing this band on his forehead, and that band actually contains these EEG sensors. And he possibly has sensors on the back of his head as well, I suspect, because what he's doing, you can actually see this in the signal diagram on the right. Alvin Lucier did this whole piece using analog electronics, it being the mid to late 70s. What he did here is he has a stage where he's actually doing something that's very similar to one of the plots that I mentioned to you at the beginning of this conversation. And he is he's selecting only some frequencies of his brainwave signal, and he's doing that with analog electronics. The frequency that he happens to be working with is called the alpha frequency. These are fluctuations in his EEG that happen between 8 and 13 cycles per second. And these are known to change quite a bit when somebody opens and closes their eyes. So very similar again to one of the plots that I showed you at the beginning of our chat. What you can see here is that he's actually making this grand gesture of whether his eyes are open or closed, because he's trying to indicate to the audience something about what he is doing inside, what he is doing with his outward gestures to create changes in the brainwave signal that you can then hear in the sounds. In this case, what he's doing is taking just that raw voltage fluctuation that is created in the brainwave signal, and he's amplifying that. He's selecting only that alpha frequency band, and then he is taking that voltage, sending it through an amplifier, and then connecting that directly to a speaker. And then the speakers are connected to various kinds of drums and cymbals, all kinds of percussion around the room. And in this way, his brainwave signal can more or less directly play all of these acoustic instruments on the stage. It's actually quite amazing, you know, what he was able to do here with very simple electronics. And in a lot of ways, the kinds of performances that I've been doing in my work are no different, you know, from what Alvin Lucier devised, you know, all these decades ago. It's just that with computers now, we can experiment with different ways of analyzing that signal, but on a conceptual level, there's really, you know, no advancement that has happened since all these years ago.
Okay, so we have another question from a very puzzled student. He says, my music teacher say math is also found in music. How is that so?
So the music teacher says that math is often found in music?
Yes, that's his question. So how is that so?
Oh, that's a very good question. So, and that's, you know, a very interesting, you know, let me think a little bit about how I'm going to describe that. So music is a very interesting kind of stimulus. When I say stimulus, it just means that any kind of visual thing that we, you know, pay attention to, a TV screen, any kind of object that we notice around us, or in any kind of sound that plays, in that it varies in time. You know, we can look at a coffee cup in front of you, and that is not going to change in time. Or we can look at a beautiful painting on the wall, and that a painting is not going to change. But music is special in that it only becomes music when there's some kind of change that will happen in time. And just like we need to create certain patterns in a painting in order for us to be able to understand what the artist is trying to communicate to us, in music, there are very specific patterns that we have to create in order to communicate some kind of feeling or some kind of idea. And those patterns need to exist in some kind of way where we can start to see one idea being repeated over and over again, so that we can build some kind of expectation of what is going to happen in the future. And the way that we build those kinds of anticipations or expectations, the way that the music ends up surprising us because it does not do something that we expect, or the way that it does fulfill what we expect, that is the underlying tension in the music that creates meaning for us, and that allows music to create feelings for us. But those patterns themselves those patterns reflect underlying mathematical principles. And if we can understand the math behind those patterns, then we can start to try to decode what it is that the brain is expecting when it's listening to this music. So as an example, if you go back to that spectral plot that I was showing you before, and in fact, I might share my screen again so I can show this to you. So I'm going to jump back, or this is actually another good example. Whoops. So we can see here, if you look at this video here of this white dot moving on the screen. So this video represents somebody moving expressively to a piece of music that they're listening to. And we can see here that there's something that is happening in time, and that it's a cycle happening in time, but perhaps every cycle that will happen, there's a slight shift. And that slight shift in this repeated cycle is what brings along a particular feeling or emotion. And this is how this person is trying to change their movement in order to express a particular feeling or idea. And the way that we anticipate that small shift is, ends up being reflected in the brain waves themselves. And that's this kind of red splotch that we see here on the screen. We can actually see in the brain when somebody will kind of anticipate this small expressive change in the music. And this change only happens when somebody is very emotionally invested or engaged in that particular kind of music. I can show you an example again. If we go back to these plots, we can actually use math to describe what the relationship is between all of these red layers that we see in this signal here. This again is a spectrogram of the Berg violin concerto. And we can see here that there's a discernible pattern. There's a kind of predictability in the pattern that these red lines create in this spectral plot. And what this is telling us is that the brain is actively interpreting this spectrum, this kind of shape of the relationship between these frequencies, and it's gathering meaning from that as the music progresses. So we can actually use math to model what the relationship is between these these kind of horizontal red lines, but also the vertical lines that we see here in this plot. So we see a regular repeated pattern here, which represents the tempo of the music. And the way that these patterns exist in time also follows very strict mathematical rules that we can use to model how meaning is created in this particular musical signal. There are so many examples, that I can illustrate for you about how music follows these kinds of mathematical principles. For example, just looking at a series of musical pitches and the ways that we create, when we learn about music theory and we're being instructed to learn how to compose a particular musical sequence that is going to make sense for the listener, those sequences follow mathematical principles entirely. And so So while your teacher, is when your teacher is describing how math is involved in music, it might not be the case that you're solving binomial equations on the chalkboard and then that will make a musical sound. It's more that we can use mathematical principles to examine and create these kinds of patterns that we can see in the relationship between the musical notes and how those relationships between the musical notes end up creating musical meaning for somebody who is listening to them.
Okay, so there are actually some more questions, but I'm going to come back later. I'll just move on first. So MIT Lab is also working with you on music that slows down breathing. So could you tell us more on what you have found out during this research?
Sure, I'd be happy to. Oops. So Marcus is referring to this work that I completed with Roz Picard and Asma Gandharian when I was a postdoc working at the MIT Media Lab. This was a case where we produced a computer algorithm that would generate music. And I'm going to play an example of what this sounds like to you. So Marcus, I believe that this was like your favorite music that you heard
Yes,
in the presentation before.
yeah.
So this was designed to help a listener slow down their breathing. This was designed this way, but we actually had to run an experiment to test to see if it worked. What this music does is the algorithm has one of the voices in the music increase in volume and decrease in volume, following the same path or curve that somebody's breathing takes when that person is breathing at an optimal rate. This is a rate that has been determined from previous research to produce the most relaxation for somebody. This was inspired by previous work that Roz and Asma had done that showed them that by experiencing some kind of stimulus that somebody can change their behavior in response to that, and that it can produce beneficial physiological changes. So we actually did this experiment where we played music for people. We played this exact music that you heard for a whole bunch of listeners. We also recorded their breathing. We recorded their skin conductance level, which is these small changes in the way that your body sends your salty sweat to your skin that actually changes in response to shifts in your autonomic nervous system activity. So very briefly, you end up seeing more sweat on the surface layers of your skin when you become more excited, when you become more nervous or more stressed, and you see reduced amounts of that water in your skin when you become more relaxed. And so what we found, so we recorded this skin conductance level, and in addition, we recorded EEG, like I've been describing to you before. And we can see here that when people listened to this music, they reduced their breathing rate. So just like we had designed for, but we also, because their breathing reduced, we also saw changes in their skin conductance level. So this is a indication that their autonomic activity was actually reducing. We saw changes in their heart rate, and we also saw changes in their EEG. So this is just an example of how, merely listening to a musical signal. And this was actually a case where we simply played the music in the room for the listener, but we didn't instruct them to pay attention to it. We actually gave them a really boring task to complete on the computer, to make sure that this music was kind of displayed to them in a very non-focused way. So merely just listening to this music and having that music respond to the person's own breathing, produced this really strong change in their physiology that we could measure in a number of ways.
All right. So Dr. Grace is also a musician and a composer. She has created some amazing brain music that calms the brain and body. I have personally enjoyed it. Dr. Grace, do you mind sharing the video of the music performance that you have filmed and created?
Sure. So this is my page on Bandcamp. This is really like the portal by which I share my music to the world, and you can stream all of this music for free on Bandcamp. You can search for Grace Leslie and find that page there. But one of these examples that I'm going to show you, this is a recording that was made a couple of years ago. Max Citrin engineered this. He recorded the video and sound in the MIT chapel. So this is, still while I was a postdoc working at the MIT Media Lab. And so this is actually showing me sitting in the chapel playing the flute and electronics. There's software here that is converting my brainwaves into sound, but also there is software that is recording my flute and voice sounds and playing that back in a kind of looping pattern. So what you're hearing is the flute and voice sounds mixed together with the brainwave sound. So you all can hear more of that on my website, but also this is a recording called Chapel that you can find on my Bandcamp as well.
All right, I'm going to get some questions from the viewers. So we have question from a lazy student. So in future, I could potentially use my brainwave to control a machine to do my homework.
So that's a very interesting question. Brain-computer interfaces are designed to measure intent from somebody. And so the most that we can do is try to decode what somebody is intending to choose with the computer, what they're intending, how they're intending to interact with the computer. But you still need to register the proper intent to be able to do that. And so I don't think that a brain-computer interface itself will still be able to create its own intent, knowing, for instance, to choose answer A over answer B. While we might be able to decode whether you want to choose answer A or answer B using a brain-computer interface, still the interface itself is not going to know the correct answer to that question. And so I have a disappointing news for your viewer in that way, that I don't think that the interface itself is going to be able to help you with your homework.
All right, another question is by Deepika. Is it true that people who are musically inclined are good at math?
That's a good question. I think that there is, evidence that people who are gifted in music performance or music composition can also be gifted in math. I know that anecdotally from my own life, looking at my colleagues, and there are a lot of people who are very interested in math, who are very active in music as well. But there are a lot of examples that do not fall in that camp. And there's also a lot of ways that people can be good at music. There's a lot of different types of music creativity and musical expression. And some of those are more mathematically oriented than others. And I wouldn't want to discount all of the different ways that people can experience music and create music that might not necessarily, operate with so much mathematical complexity, but still retain the ability to create very moving experiences for the people who listen to it.
Okay, so we have a comment from an inspired student. So this is not a question, but I want to say Grace Leslie's work is cool. Not only does it involves math, not only does it involve music and neurology, it also involves math. Yeah, so that was a comment. Moving on to another question by one of our viewer named Tim. We always think of music and dance as hobbies, but you are doing serious engineering with music. What kind of research career opportunities exist for young people who wish to marry arts and arts with coding and engineering?
That's a great question. So, in the computer technology industry right now, at every one of these large companies that you hear about, there's a team of people who works with audio and musical sound. Because, just like we spend a lot of energy engineering computer screens to be very sharp and have very fast a graphics capability, there's also a lot of attention that's paid into the way that computers create sound. And I think increasingly so when we're starting to consider the kind of environments that computers create for the people who use them day in and day out. The way that we surround a user with sound has a big impact on their mood throughout the day and the way that they interact with the computer. And so knowing what we do now about the way that music and sound changes that experience for users, there's a lot of companies that are paying a lot of attention to this part of that user experience. And so, when I look at students who graduate, from our undergraduate and master's and PhD programs at Georgia Tech, in the music technology program, they go on to get jobs at Bose and Dolby and Apple and Google and Samsung, all of these big companies that are looking for people who have engineering backgrounds, who want to work, in the technology industry, but also have this specialty in working with music and sound, because it's such an important part of the user experience.
Sorry, I was muted. Yeah, so we have about 10 more minutes left. We'll take a few more questions. We have a learning student. So his question is, by any chance we have an answer why we find consonant chords pleasant sounding, while dissonant chords tend to be unpleasant? Aren't they all just superposition of wave?
Yes, okay, that's a really great question, and there's a couple of different reasons why, and we're also still learning about this, on a neurological level. So on one side of the answer are, as your listener illustrated here, these kind of superposition of waves. So if you remember that spectral plot that I showed you before that had all these horizontal striations of the frequency content in the sound, you will notice that even when you simply play one note on a piano or on a violin, that note, that one pitch that you hear, A440, let's say, actually contains a lot of different frequencies. It contains A440, but it also contains A880, A1760, I believe, on top of that. So it contains that first fundamental or base frequency of A440 plus 440 times all of the integers above that. The relative strengths of those various components of the sound are what make the difference between a piano sound playing A440 and a violin sound playing A440. That's why those two musical pitches are going to have the same musical pitch, but different overall sound qualities or timbres, we call it. So the magic here happens when we start to play two musical pitches together and we superpose them, as your listener described. What happens is that if we combine two musical pitches, if we play them together, so like two fingers on the piano, if those notes are chosen so that they exist within a very simple relationship, then you're going to have all of those horizontal lines that you see there in that spectrum are going to fit together really perfectly. So if you have a A440 note that is played at the same time as an 880 note, you'll see that these lines are going to shift upwards, but all of these are going to superimpose very nicely, and all of that harmonic content is going to kind of fit together like a puzzle piece. Now, if you choose two notes on the piano that have a very complex relationship between them, for instance, two notes that are very close together on that piano keyboard. So if you play like a C and a C sharp at the same time, what you'll see here is that you get these two spectrum. You have your C middle C note here, and then that C sharp is only slightly above this. Let me put my fingers closer to the camera. And so what you'll see here is in all of these frequencies that you see as part of those musical notes, you start to get these frequencies that are very close together, not only just for the fundamental frequency, that C and that C sharp right here, but all of these harmonics above here. And what happens actually in the ear is that there's this transduction that happens where the acoustical waves that come into the ear, they hit against the eardrum. And then there's a small snail-like organ inside the ear called the basilar membrane. And the basilar membrane is basically like this snail shell that kind of winds like this. And if you unwind that snail shell, what you'll find is that it's covered with these auditory, nerve fibers. And some of those fibers are designed to transmit electrical signals when they experience a very low frequency energy. And then some of them are designed to transmit electrical pulses to the brain when they hear a very high frequency. So when we have these two signals and you hear these two frequencies that are very close together, you end up getting two hairs or multiple hairs along the basilar membrane that are trying to figure out which nerve fiber should be firing. But there's kind of overlap between multiple nerve fibers. And this is actually a very abnormal and unpleasant kind of experience for the brain to try to figure out what frequency is actually triggering this organ in the ear. And for that reason, there's a kind of sensation of unpleasantness that we experience in any kind of sound that creates a very strong interaction along the basilar membrane between those multiple components of the sound. And so this is, when your listener asked about superposition of frequencies and how it creates this feeling of consonance and a dissonance, you can see here that a dissonant interval, which is an example of one where we have these frequencies where it's not quite matching completely, this is going to create this kind of superposition of movement along this organ in the ear that is interpreted as being unpleasant. Whereas when these intervals have these harmonics that line up very perfectly, these are going to be very, evenly spaced along the basilar membrane, and the brain is able to identify what those pitches are much more easily. And that's when we get this sensation of a musical interval being very consonant. So just to make this a little bit more complicated, one step more complicated, I did want to mention that this is on, there are multiple explanations for this kind of effect. On, what I just described to you is the most low level one, meaning the one that is, just working at the level of how the human brain is really interpreting these kinds of sensory signals. There's, on the other side of this, is a phenomenon whereby people are trained to expect certain things and to ascribe pleasantness or unpleasantness depending on what their experience is throughout their life. And there are examples where if somebody, grows up in a particular musical culture where where there might be a unique perspective about what sounds are consonant and pleasant and what sounds are dissonant and unpleasant, they might actually have different reactions to those sounds. So depending on their own personal experience and their culture's perspective about these sounds. This is kind of a more, what we call a more high level explanation of this. And then there are, theories all along this spectrum. On one side, this is something this is a idea that we're trying to ascribe to any human being, regardless of what their experience is. And on the other side, there are aspects of these theories that really depend on what kinds of music somebody has heard in their past and how that affects the way that they will interpret that music.
Very interesting. So I'm going to do one last question due to short on time. This question goes, if music is so beneficial, can your work contribute to people who are hearing impaired to experience the positive effects of music, even if they can't hear it?
Sure. So there's a whole area of research in the human-computer interfaces world called haptics, HAPTICS. And this is research about how we can look at the way that touch will affect us. We have all kinds of different sensors in the skin. There's actually different kinds of sensory organs at different layers in the skin that are responsive to different kinds of frequencies. And while these might be different than the human ear, they may operate in a similar way, at least for one part of this spectrum that I was talking about just before. In the sense that we can impart certain kinds of sensory information and perhaps affective information, meaning feelings, using these kinds of haptic signals. So at its most simple, you can imagine if you've ever used a subwoofer, connected to your movie system at home and placed your hand on it while you're listening to a horror movie, for instance. And when the music is playing during a particularly scary part of that movie, you can imagine that you could put your hand on that subwoofer and feel the way that the subwoofer is transmitting that particular auditory signal. Even if you couldn't hear it, you could still feel through the sensors in your hand what is going on in that signal. And we do know that people are able to interpret this kind of affective content, whether the music is pleasant sounding or excited or slow or sad or scary. We can actually feel these kinds of feelings through these haptic signals. There are, also examples of music performers who can't hear, like Evelyn Kuleni, who is a famous percussionist who is deaf, but she is able to impart this kind of affective element in her music performance. Even though she can't hear the music, she can still feel it through her hands. And so there's a way that so much of what is meaningful about the musical experience for us might not necessarily be entirely contained in the sound itself, but is actually contained as well in how the music feels to us, and also how it looks to us when we see the way that somebody is moving when they're performing. We can actually get a lot of information about what kind of feeling and musical idea that they're trying to portray in their performance.
All right, so I think that's all we have today. We have come to the end of this episode of Untamed Conversation. Thank you so much, Dr. Grace, for being with us today and giving us this very intriguing conversation. It has been a pleasure hosting you. So now we all know that specially created sounds and music for the brain and body can help with our mental health. For the viewers at home, if you would like to know more about her work and listen to her crafted music, I would very much like to encourage you to visit her webpage at www.graceleslie.com. Her personalized music based on scientific research gives off the feeling of gentleness and calmness, which promises to help you in enhancing your mental health and well-being. So thank you once again, Dr. Grace, for being with us.
Thank you so much. It was my pleasure.
All right. So thank you everyone for tuning in, and remember to hashtag UntamedSG in your social media posts to win the lucky prizes sponsored by US Embassy. So names of all lucky winners will be posted on our Untamed Facebook page. So keep a lookout for that. Okay. And with that, thank you very much. And remember, when it comes to STEM, nothing is beyond boundaries.